I'm not missing anything. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Uh,
So I'll
Great.
start right away. And I wanted to first of all ask you that what inspired you to study and work on archaeology and then more specifically Anatolian archaeology.
Okay, great. Well, that's a wonderful story, and I'm happy to share it with you. There are basically two reasons that dragged me into archaeology. One is very trivial, the other not so, eventually, but I'd be happy to share both of them. So I don't know what the readers might think about it, but one incentive to study archaeology was the Indiana Jones movies. Yes, they were. I was, well, Indiana Jones has nothing to do with archaeology from a professional point of view, but I was intrigued by this guy wearing this wonderful suits, and I still love wearing similar stuff in class, loafers and tweed jackets and stuff. And I was inspired. And this guy is teaching at this Ivy League university, and then he embarks on adventures, taking him to the far corners of the world. I like that, and I was kind of inspired by that. Well, the second reason is actually a bit more, not really complex, but not so trivial after all. I was doing sports archery some time ago in a small sports archery club, and one of the club members was the local archaeologist. I was still in high school, and then, since we had, of course, this very cordial atmosphere and were engaging in competitions and the like, he asked me whether I would be interested in participating in a dig. And I said yes. And then it had me. So that was a rescue excavation, as many excavation projects are, that happened in Bavaria back in the 1990s. After all, we were excavating an early Neolithic village, or what was left of it, from the 6th millennium BC, and I was totally fascinated by that. Uh, the others participating in this rescue dig were far less amazed because said, "Oh, that's another Neolithic village." I later on learned that they're very common. There are lots of them, and they basically all look the same. It's the same type of house, the same type of inventories from the 6th millennium. But for me, that was a real epiphany of sorts and a game changer. And I decided to study archaeology. What brought me actually in Anatolian archaeology is a bit of a different story again. I started studying at the University of Regensburg in Bavaria, and our professors or the assistants there were mainly instructing us about local archaeology, about local archaeological cultures, Bavaria, Central Europe. The chair of the department had a bit of a wider perspective and also were including um, Mediterranean archaeology and a bit of Italian Iron Age and the like, but still that was very much focused on Europe, not so much Anatolia. But then a new professor came, Andreas Müller-Karpe, who later on became a professor at Marburg University. He got that wasn't a tenure position, that was a fixed term position, I believe, a special professorship for 2 years or 3 years, and he was exclusively doing Anatolian archaeology. And he took me on a dig here in Turkey back in 1996. That must have been the year. Yes, indeed. 1996. That was my first time excavating in Turkey, in Eastern Cappadocia. So, uh, uh, Şarkışla, Altın Yayla, which is kind of in the district of Sivas. And we excavated what later on turned out to be a Hittite provincial town. And we even learned the name of this town because there were texts, cuneiform tablets that were excavated. So the name of this town later on was confirmed to be Sar Issa. And ever since, I decided to pursue Anatolian archaeology. But lucky me, I had a previous training in European archaeology, which was great because that was, after all, also the reason I got the job at Bilkent, because I could do both. I could do classical, not classical archaeology, sorry, but traditional European continental archaeology, but also Anatolian archaeology. Um, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Okay,
All
okay.
right, okay.
Sorry. I mean, that's amazing. That's an amazing story. And Turkey especially has such, it's sitting at such a crossroad of major ancient civilizations. So what do you think about its unique geographic position? How has this shaped the archaeological record of Anatolia? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, starting with its geographical positions, Anatolia was and still is described as a bridge linking East and West, the Orient and the Occident.
Mhm.
Which is not very true. It's a very passive thing to be a bridge. It's just linking regions where eventual innovations take place.
Mhm.
This is really not the case for Anatolia. Anatolia itself, or Turkey, in its modern borders, was a very innovative region with lots of things that we see here that started at very early times. Let me give you an example. Early experimental approaches to manipulating metals, copper especially, that starts very, very early here, much earlier than in any other part of the world. It's a more playful experimental approach to dealing with copper, to manipulating it, shaping it. So it's not real smelting at that point, but we have earliest evidence for copper working now, taking us back well into the ninth and even the 10th millennium BC. Then, sure enough, there is the great evidence from Göbekli Tepe
Yeah,
and the neighboring sites, Karahan Tepe, Sayburç, and the like. Maybe we'll talk
yeah,
about it also later, which show that there's lots of exciting and still puzzling things going on the onset of the Holocene, the onset of the what we call the earliest Neolithic here, 12,000 years ago. So Anatolia itself, merely being a bridge linking the East and West and transferring technologies and customs and social issues, whatever, we should consider it more as also motor for innovative approaches. Of course, also linking different cultures, different regions, being accessible from the sea and from the land. So having Mesopotamia as a neighbor, the Aegean world, the Mediterranean world, the Caucasus and the Black Sea, which more and more turns out to be another very innovative and dynamic region in prehistory. So this makes it a very unique place for many, many different uh, yeah, cultures and also technologies and experiments that took place there. Another thing that we have to mention here is, of course, the onset of sedentary life. So
yeah.
Anatolia is the place
Uh-huh.
where these first experimental approaches to this new, very difficult and very risky way of life
Yeah.
were tested
Uh-huh.
back 12,000 years ago.
Wow. Okay. So you just mentioned about copper and all these metals.
Mhm.
Your expertise is also in metallurgy. So what can you tell us about how these metals tell the stories of the ancient societies, and also what do they reveal about the trade and the knowledge transfer? Because as you mentioned, that
Mm,
there is a lot of that happening already.
yeah. Back in the old days, 1990s, I believe, there was a nice symposium titled "Metals Make the World Go Round," which is pretty true
Uh-huh.
because metals were and still are a big incentive for inter-region international trade
Yeah.
and also many negative issues associated with
Yeah.
that, talking about exploitation and the like.
Yeah.
So, what's the story about metals? Well, here we have this very, very early kind of playful experimental approaches to metalworking. Uh, Anatolia is one of the highest mineralized regions in the world. So there's lots of deposits which are comparably easily accessible. So there are still places here in the countryside where you don't have to work your gallery into the rock. You just grab the sulfidic copper from the surface and start dealing with it.
Mhm.
Why did people do that? Well, basically, well, copper itself has, of course, eventually, depending on its chemical composition, a very conspicuous sheen. But
Mhm.
of course, there is the oxidized version of copper, which is malachite,
Mhm.
which is technically it's a gemstone. It's still used as a gemstone, but it's oxidized copper. So people eventually harvested that for the greenish color, and we know that they used it as a pigment to paint the walls and floors of very early village buildings back in the earliest Neolithic. Then they started manipulating little nodules,
Mhm.
cold hammering them, annealing them, which means they were heating them in the fire or putting them under the charcoal to shape them more easily. That sounds already very much advanced of
Yeah.
sorts or related to metalworking. Actually, it's not. This is stoneworking because ancient communities basically do the same with stone.
Mhm.
They manipulate flintstone or other siliceous stones like obsidian
Mhm.
while, flaking it, but also heating it in the fire because when you do that, you can shape it more easily.
Yeah.
So they consider copper as some kind of fancy type of stone. But then comes the big breakthrough. 5000 BC, approximately, we have the first clearly cast object. So we have extractive metallurgy.
Mhm.
And the weird thing is that that occurs here in Anatolia, but I personally doubt that there's an intimate connection to this playful cold hammering and annealing, something else
Mhm.
to smelt it, because you need more than 1080 degrees to do that. A normal campfire has 4 to 500, so you have to add oxygen, you have to start this process, and there's still a big question how people came about that.
Mhm.
And it starts in many different places, seemingly independently. We
Mhm.
have early extractive metallurgy items from metal items from Palestine. We have items from Serbia, but they're totally unconnected. But it also starts here in Anatolia, and then something very weird happens because nothing happens. It's there and it's gone for about 1,500 years. So, talking about the social implications here, what happened? So, we have early evidence from sites on the southern Anatolian coast, which is Mersin, Yumuktepe.
Mhm.
And here, about 5,000 BC, we have real cast metal objects. And then it stops. It seems that there was kind of colony established by experts, and then they moved on, or whatever happened. There's almost nothing going on in Anatolia for 1,500 years, but the Balkans and even Central Europe is bustling with extractive metallurgy. And then it comes back.
Mhm.
So, since about 3,500, we have a revival of metalwork, metal production and consumption, and then that goes on well into the third millennium, into the early Bronze Age, and here we have all these fantastic influence and alloying techniques and superior metalwork, uh, like the famous, infamous Troy treasures,
Yeah. Yeah.
treasures from Troya, or the royal burials, the inventories of the so-called royal burials from Allergehüg and the like.
Mhm.
So there's still a big question what happens within this 1,500 years, from 5,000 to 3,500. Were these experts who finally resolved the problem of smelting, of liquefying copper, were they moving somewhere else
Mhm.
into Europe? Did they take the knowledge with them? Why is there almost nothing going on here? And it cannot be just a gap in the research because there's all these excavations, and of course there are places we excavate which date back to 5,000, 4,500 BC or whatever,
Mhm.
but there's no real metallurgy. But it
Mhm.
comes back, and then it comes back with a big boom.
Mhm.
And since the third millennium, we have all this amazing alloying and casting and plating and soldering and granulation and all these specific techniques
Mhm.
exemplified here in Anatolian metalwork.
Mhm. That's
And of
interesting.
course, here coinciding with that, we sure enough have the emergence of real elites, social elites who are controlling the resources,
Yeah.
controlling the work, eventually also controlling the expertise,
Mhm.
not disseminating this very much
So the
to other
hierarchy was
places.
being developed along the
Yes,
way.
yes, yes. Actually, talking about hierarchies, um, well, sadly enough, there's, I think, no human community which has no hierarchy. Hierarchies are always there. That's how we are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes they're very low, or they're a little bit hidden, but actually they're always there.
Yeah.
But then it becomes way more visible
Mhm.
since the third millennium
Mhm.
with yeah, residential buildings, citadels like Troja, famous example, fortified places with the elite residing there, consuming very different types of things from
Mhm.
the commoners. So they distinguish themselves also. We can see that in the archaeological record. There's still no writing here, but that's what the artifacts are telling us, that
Mhm.
there definitely was a hierarchy of sorts and
Mhm.
the emergence of elites
Mhm.
here, uh, accelerated also by the revival of metalwork and coinciding with the control of resources, the
Yeah.
exploitation of resources, and the like.
Mhm. Okay. I like
Mhm.
to pivot towards more of scientific research. So, right now, there are a lot of new techniques within scientific analysis. We have
Mhm.
X-ray fluorescence, and archimetry, DNA analysis. So, how has that changed archaeology? Because previously, I mean, it was as shown in the movies, it's just digging up bones and then.
Yeah, no.
But now
So
we have
we,
more advancemment. So how has that
yeah.
changed the field in general?
Oh, very dramatically, actually. So the lots of paradigms, lots of the trajectory of archaeology changed dramatically for the past half a century, I believe.
Mhm.
So moving away from this purely antiquarian approach to things, cataloging, exhibiting, presenting things, putting them on display. So that was actually, yeah, the incentive of archaeology. The most dramatic dwarfing of the field actually was made by Schliemann. So I have not very much positive things to tell about this man, but
Uh,
Heinrich Schliemann, always associated with the beginning of archaeological fieldwork at Troy,
yeah.
with all the shortcomings and all the problems. He defined archaeology as a discipline. He thought of himself as an archaeologist. He was not, anyway, other
Mhm.
topic. Well, he said that archaeology as a discipline is only good for proving the authenticity of the Homeric tales. This is what archaeology is good for, nothing else. That's a very narrow definition. But that was a bit of that was his very personal approach, but even others, they considered archaeology as, yeah, like the very trivial observation of digging up stuff that looks interesting and exhibiting it.
Mhm.
Well, archaeology moved far away from that.
Yeah.
So, also, of course, professional archaeology, as soon as it was established in the 20th century, pursued very different questions
Mhm.
like who are we and how did we got here? So, why are we the way we are? How was the development in establishing communities, complex societies? The earliest urban centers and the like. So, what happened there in the course of these many millennia? And archaeological science, of course, is a real big game changer in that.
Mhm.
Well, a simple example, since we mentioned it and we talked about, is metal analysis.
Yeah.
So if you just inspect metal objects with a naked eye inspection,
Mhm.
so the thing is, well, okay, that looks like bronze. Well, bronze is copper and tin.
Uh-huh.
It could be also arsenical copper. It could be antimony copper. We don't know. But
Yeah.
of course, pending the results, there's very different questions we have to ask. Where do the raw materials come from? For
Mhm.
bronze, where does the tin come from? Tin is very rare.
Mhm.
So where did the tin come from? This is still a question which is not completely resolved, but there's lots of research going on in that field. Or something, it looks like gold. Is it gold? Might be brass. It might be something
Yeah.
completely different. So only this simple example with analytical techniques, of course, opens a
Yeah.
completely new world for us.
Mhm.
Then, coinciding with that, well, bulk analysis is very common. We started it with colleagues back in 2004, 2006, and we were still one of the very few pursuing it. Now it's actually done by all expeditions and most of the universities. They even do have the devices to do a quick scan of
Mhm.
objects with non-destructive X-ray fluorescence analysis,
Yeah.
which has its own problems and pitfalls since we are dealing with heterogeneous
Yeah.
objects a lot. So it's not like uh, uh, modern industrial objects where you can just scan and you have the result and that's it.
Yeah.
It's a very different procedure we have to apply. Other things, of course, like lead isotope analysis, which tells us where the raw material from an object actually comes from, where the
Yeah.
copper comes from. This opens completely new dimensions for further questions we have to ask on the material. There's the case, again, referring to Troja as a site that I think also many of your readers
Mhm.
heard about or know, that we have all these metal artifacts. And if you look at them, okay, a dagger is a dagger, a knife is a knife, a pin is a pin. Doesn't change.
Mhm.
But the raw material changes.
Yeah.
In the first half of the third millennium, the copper comes from regional sources. In the second half of the third millennium, the objects still look the same basically, but the copper comes from a completely different place.
Mhm.
Not from the Balkans, not from Anatolia, from far away, obviously. So this, of course, triggers completely different questions we have to ask. So this is only for metalwork, but think
Yeah.
about all the other techniques, not to talk about dating,
Yeah.
with radiocarbon, thermoluminescence, optical stimulated luminescence, which allows us to date siliceous substances, electronic spin resonance dating. So there's oxygen isotope dating, all these fancy new techniques that we can apply. And finally, the biggest game changer at the moment is, of course, genetics, ancient
Yeah.
DNA,
DNA sequencing. Yeah. Yeah.
which presents us with a real avalanche
Data.
of
Yeah.
data we have to
Yeah.
digest.
Mhm. I'd like to go back to one thing that you mentioned earlier, that these hierarchies, for example, have been prevalent
Mhm.
across all societies. I want to ask, what parallels do you see between ancient societies and the challenges that the modern societies face today? So, for instance, like natural disasters or some things that we see. But other
Sure.
than that, what other parallels do you see?
Well, talking about parallels, there's this very unfortunate quote. I have to check who said it. Was George Antoniana or another historian that the only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. There's also the fate of history repeating, etc. Now, there's no necessity to go into that and to elevate this to this high philosophical level. But indeed, to understand modern challenges, the more we look back into ancient worlds and ancient societies and the way how they responded to crisis, especially, gives us very important insights into modern challenges that we have. Let me give you an example from the late second millennium. BC, again focusing on Anatolia. Here we have what we call the collapse of the ancient Mediterranean civilization. So the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptian pharaonic kingdom, the Assyrian kingdom, they seem to have been wiped out from the map and collapsed, which is not really true. We
Mhm.
see that life is continuing. There's a transformation going on for sure, but it's much more complex than we thought. And one of the triggers here, which is still vividly debated, is climate change. It's what we call an RCC, a rapid climate change at the end of the second millennium, a kind of wiggle we
Mhm.
see in the chart, which eventually affected also greater or larger regions here. And what we see are also migration waves, uh, possibly also triggered by climate change. So
Mhm.
it's again, we learn nothing from history, don't we? So we have obviously very substantial waves of migration from people coming from Europe.
Mhm.
You're moving into the Balkans and further into Anatolia, which is only one aspect of the whole story for sure.
Yeah.
There are other incidents, like something that is still very much subject to very controversial debate, the 4.2K phenomenon. This is another alleged climate worsening at the end of the third millennium, lasting for about 300 years. So from approximately 2200 to 2000, 1900 BC. And there's a big discussion of, is this something that leads to the collapse of the Assyrian Empire, for example, or the Assyrian kingdom at that point? But now we see that the response of human communities was very diverse and very different, changing from region to region. There's cases of micro-regions which obviously suffer from this severe drought. It's a period of severe drought, obviously, of very little precipitation lasting for about 200 to 300 years. But it's regionally very diverse. And the response of human communities is very, very different. Some of them are very inventive. They start building very sophisticated wells and water reservoirs. Others, they obviously don't experience any drawback at all. Quite the contrary, they start thriving.
Mhm.
So it's not like there's this big collapse and the big crash caused by climate change. It's not the case. So human communities, as it seems, that's the lesson we learn from the archaeological research, focusing on this particular period, are very resilient
Yeah. Yeah.
and also very inventive. Just coping with it, or even developing strategies here over a longer period
Mhm.
to cope with that.
Mhm.
So that's what we see in the archaeological record. It's much more diverse. It's not
Yeah.
like something happens, there comes the big crash.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, humans are definitely resilient, and I guess we'll
Mhm.
see in the next years, because the times are changing, and then a lot of things, climate change, migration,
Mhm.
political, sort of
Yeah.
environment is changing. But I agree with you. I mean, the resilience has always been there, so we'll see.
Yes, and other things that we experience when we are trying to contextualize the archaeological realities, the architecture, the environmental data we have, the artifacts we have. As a species, as human beings, we are very gullible,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
obviously we uh, do decisions which s sound or look totally, uh, how to say, weird
Absurd.
or illogical. So you know that in the 1960s there was this very positivist approach to human culture and civilization that said everything can explain through
Yeah.
statistics and
Yeah.
data. this is not the case anymore.
Mhm.
There's the concept in archaeology now, especially also for prehistoric archaeology, when we are confronted with phenomena we cannot really explain through applying a logical, positivistic approach to things. Like uh, s- communities, where do they settle? Of course, at the most fertile places, where there's lots of water resources, where there's lots of food sources available. We see that's not necessarily the case.
Mhm.
That they decide otherwise, and also very illogical and irrational.
Yeah.
A great example from Anatolia, Çatalhöyük.
Mhm.
Probably, maybe you traveled there even when at your
I
time
haven't
here
been. I haven't
at
been.
Konya. It's a famous place. It's a large village
Uh-huh.
from the late 8th and especially 7th millennium. So human communities settled there for more than 1,000 years,
Mhm.
and they decided to settle in one of the worst places possible, in a swamp. They settled in a swamp.
Mhm.
And they had to cope with all kinds of hardships they
Mhm.
could have easily avoided, settling just a few kilometers
Yeah.
away. No,
Yeah.
they settled in a swamp. They had all the buildings were constantly damp because the mud brick was wet with water, so they had to burn fires day and night in the houses to keep the walls dry, which caused another problem, which is soot, which blackened the walls and also created a very unhealthy atmosphere. Still, they endured it for more than 1,000 years. Why? In archaeology, there's now the concept of charismatic or inspired individuals, as we call them,
Mhm.
eventually capable, and we see still examples from modern politics,
Yeah.
to convince people to do stupid things.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually so. Why would a community do
Yeah.
that? Because there was eventually someone telling them that a voice that this person heard told him that this is the place we have to settle. And people followed this person and endured all easily avoidable hardships. Well, that's us.
I mean, that's explainable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Human
Another
being.
lesson we learned from studying the past.
Uh-huh.
That our decisions are sometimes extremely irrational.
Yeah. Yeah. I have one been sharing all these bits of history that
Yeah,
that
so
are
they
really
say.
fascinating. So I wanted to ask that you have worked on multiple excavation projects across Turkey.
Mhm.
So what has been a particularly memorable or surprising, time in your field work, or something that you discovered, or something that really enjoyed doing?
Oh, that's a difficult question.
Uh-huh.
So, um, well, actually, any activity, any dig, any laboratory work can produce very exciting results. So, one of the most exciting experiences I had was sure enough also doing metal analysis and scanning findings from a number of different sites. There's now also a big book or a larger book chapter coming out about Kinnethuyuk,
Mhm.
which is a harbor site in Cilicia, right on the eastern Mediterranean. And there was always the suspicion, it's a large settlement, and it was always the suspicion that probably the Hittites at one point took control and used it as a strategic hub for seafaring.
Mhm.
And there was pottery, seals, so seal impressions on pottery and the like. But in the lab, that's a very specific story, but still find this fascinating. We were scanning metal objects, doing bulk analysis with X-ray fluorescence analysis,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden we had, from secure context, of course, from the second millennium BC, a number of artifacts which had a very peculiar metal composition, very peculiar. So these were um, arsenical copper alloys or also bronze, so copper and tin, but always with a very high nickel peak, high in nickel. And then it turned out that this is a very peculiar source that was mined during the Hittite imperial period and obviously restricted and controlled by the central authorities. So that was a kind of metalwork that was controlled by an authority, by a central political authority, only supplying this place with this very peculiar copper source, which is high in nickel, which comes from a very specific deposit, obviously. But
Yeah.
as far as we know, that was only used during Hittite imperial times and controlled by the central authority. So we have such items from Hattusha itself, from the capital
Mhm.
of the Hittite Empire, and now we have it also from Kinetyd. That was really fascinating because we could prove that yes, there was obviously centralized Hittite intervention here with
Yeah.
supplying this place at one point for a short period with this very exotic and peculiar raw material, which is copper, which has a very high nickel content.
Uh-huh.
So that was quite fascinating.
Uh-huh.
It was very specific, it's very
Yeah, no,
abstract,
no.
probably.
But it
Uh, Other things, oh my, yeah, there's quite a few, I believe. Uh, yeah, well, of course, my excavations back in the 1990s at the site of Kuşaklı this Hittite provincial town that I was excavated or involved in the excavation as a student. And of course, it was quite amazing to have the remains of an archive with texts, cuneiform texts, which is always quite a
yeah,
story, of course.
yeah.
And so that was also amazing. But there are many other things I might remember. The project that I'm involved in now, which is a large, um yeah, kind of early urban center right on the Syrian border at modern Kilis, and it's one of the largest mounds in Turkey. So Höyük is a human-made mountain. Basically, you know the story about
Yeah.
uh, accumulated layers, human-made accumulated layers, because here in the Near East, Anatolia, and also Mesopotamia, communities always dwelled on the debris of the previous generation. So we have these artificial mounds, the settlement mounds, the so-called Höyüks,
Mm-hmm.
and Eulemüke is one of the largest. And it's very impressive to be there. You say you're standing on a mountain, but it's all human debris.
Yeah.
It's not a natural elevation, and it's even so you are at the foothills basically, and then you climb there. There's all these hundreds and hundreds of layers of human occupation, and you stand at the top, and there's even a different climate. It's colder, the wind is blowing, so it's amazing. And
Mm-hmm.
it's all human made. It's a human made accumulation of layers that formed over thousands of years, from 5000 BC all the way to the medieval ages.
Mm-hmm.
That is my personal experiences, yeah.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I mean, it must have felt amazing to
hmm
witness that in real life. It's certainly always,
hmm
always an exciting thing to see that. Um,
hmm
well, that was all my questions.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah,
Oh,
I wish.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more we can talk, but because for the publication, it needs to be a certain size because
uh
attention span of
Sure.
the
Yeah,
reader
yeah, sure.
these days is decreasing, so you have to keep it condensed. But
Yeah.
thank you so much. I mean, you provided such wonderful
Great
support.
pleasure.
Yeah, I'm certainly
Yeah.
going to revisit this again and.
If you need any additional information or sources, I'll be very happy to provide you with whatever
Okay. Okay.
material is there.
I'll write this down and then I'll contact you again if I need anything from your side. I'll probably
Okay.
be needing a couple of your photographs to feature in the.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Uh, And yeah, thank you so much for your time, and it's a
Thank
pleasure
you very much.
talking
It
to
was
you.
great seeing you again after a couple of years. Yes.
I hope we stay in touch.